Good morning, Legacy Bible Church. We are so happy to be here again, and we are so thankful that you choose to join us whatever time of day or week that you choose to join us. Isn't this amazing that we can create such content and people can watch it anytime, whenever they want to, whenever their schedule permits? So we're very thankful for the technology that allows us to do that. This morning, Stephen and I were praying, and this is a question that I asked him that I've had often. So when we read the Bible, most of us are reading the Bible with the 21st century context. We're reading it as if it was written this year, and we read it through our lens, our 21st century lens. Well, that's not how the Bible was written, but a part of that is also what the words and what we think the words mean and what the church has told us the words mean. So in the passage that I pray in the Spirit and my mind is not fruitful, I always thought that meant when I'm praying in tongues, my mind is supposed to be empty, blank, nothing happening. But that's not what happens. My mind can still think. It's still, I might think of people while I'm praying about it. I might think of a grocery list while I'm praying, but I'm still praying in the Spirit. And consequently, I could not sit here right now and utter those words with my mind. I can't do it. I can hear it in my head from when I've prayed before, but I cannot utter those. My mind literally has to be taken aside. But all of that is to say that I asked Stephen what that meant today. And then I asked him further what it means about you will know them by their fruit. Because the church has always taught or implied that knowing them by their fruit is that you will be able to judge their character based on how they are living their lives. And that's not what that means at all. So that was just a question I had for Stephen. I'm sure he's going to touch on it just a little bit before he gets back into the epilogue of John. Today he's going to be in John 21, 13 through 19. And this is specifically about Jesus. What Jesus said, and what he's preparing for his disciples. Last week, it was about the disciples. This week, it's about Jesus. So open up your Bibles, John chapter 21, and remember, translation is everything. So take screenshots when the translation gets up there. This is all from Stavros the Wooden Bible, which is Stephen's translation that he's been working on, and it'll be years before he has the whole thing done, but it is a work in progress, and he's back to translating, which he says is like eating candy. He so loves to be there in the Word, working on all of that. So welcome to Legacy Bible Church. Like us on Facebook, subscribe to us on Facebook, follow on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, share it with your friends. Be brave. Challenge somebody to listen to something different than what they've heard all along. Welcome.
All right. Well, good morning, Legacy Bible Church. It's Sunday morning. Am I good? It's Sunday morning, and we are so glad to be back with you. To continue today, I'll continue teaching in the epilogue of John. This is going to be our fourth week in it, and I'm going to do something. It's going to be hard for me, but I'm going to give it a try here. I'm going to see if I can, in a little more abbreviated fashion, if I can finish the epilogue today. We'll see how it goes. It's important in this teaching, and I don't ever want to diminish or discount the importance of making sure that we're doing justice to what the text is saying, what it's meaning, because this is a restorative ministry. We're restoring the meaning that the original authors intended when they wrote the text, and it's been lost. It's been reinterpreted through the age of the church. It's been reinterpreted through a certain theological lens that we're actually going to talk about today. You're going to see the I guess you will say an effect, if not the manifestation of that cause right here in the text, right in the epilogue. You're going to see, what do you mean that there was a reinterpretation of the text? You're going to see John, who's writing at the end of the first century, he actually hits on that whole subject pretty clearly here in the epilogue, if you know what you're reading, if you know what you're seeing. And that is what I want to make sure that I don't race across too quickly. I want you to see it. I want you to understand exactly what John is doing with his typology. This is, as I explained last week, this is a typology. I talked about the Sea of Tiberias. That's a Johannine term. They didn't call the Sea of Galilee the Sea of Tiberias in the first century. John coined that term for the purpose of typology, so that the Sea of Galilee is a representation of the world. Tiberius being the emperor of Rome, a representation of the ruler of this world. The Sea of Tiberias, the world. Another aspect of the typology there is when Peter says, when he narrates, Peter was going away to fish. Right there in the first, let me see, that is in verse 3. Simon Peter says to them, I'm going away to fish. He uses a term that's not normally used for the verb in something like this, is hupago. Hupago. It's a compound word, hupa and ago. Hupa means normally under. Ago means to lead or to bring. And together, often it means to go away. But it has a certain connotation for go away. Often the word for go away would be, say, exerchomai, would be an example, meaning out of and to come, has the inference of going away or departing. It's a lot more common. Here is a less common word, hupago. Peter's going away to fish. Hupago, very important to the typology, has the inference not just of going somewhere, like I might go to the store. You wouldn't use hupago for that. It has the inference of changing realm, that you're actually changing the realm that you're in. So if I said I'm going away to a foreign country, then I might use hupago. I'm changing the realm that I'm in. That's when you use hupago. You don't use it when you're just inferring that you're going somewhere within your current sphere of reference. And so here, the disciples are all at the Sea of Galilee, and they say, I'm going away to fish. John, the author, narrates it with the verb hupago, because it fits his typology, that when they get into the boat, they are entering into the typology is they're entering into the spiritual fellowship, entering into that heavenly spiritual fellowship, into the presence of the Lord. And so that's why he uses the verb hupago. It's a good telltale to support that he is doing a typology here. He's narrating a historical event. These things really did happen. It's real history that he's narrating. There really was an appearance of the Lord at the Sea of Galilee while they're fishing on the sea, and all of these things really happened. But John is presenting it to us as a typology for faith life during this period of the new covenant, this present age of the new covenant. And then so that's why he's using the terminology that he's using. It's a little out of the ordinary for just narrating a simple event like this. And there are clear indications that this is typology that you should be reading. You should be reading it as historical event, but understanding that most of what he's writing about in here has a secondary typological meaning relating to faith life, faith walk in the present age of the new covenant. And so that little verb there in verse 3 is just, again, it's just another telltale that it's not the verb you would expect to be used here for this. It's a telltale that he's in the realm of typology. So that boarding into the boat and going out onto the Sea of Galilee, where the Sea of Galilee is already being represented as the world, then just the verb used there, hupago, which has the typological inference of leaving the fellowship, the physical fellowship, which is in the world, and moving into a different realm, a separate realm of that spiritual fellowship in Christ Jesus. That's represented in the verb. Yes, all of that is typologically represented in the verb that the author chose. So these are all fascinating little elements of the epilogue here that help you get a deeper understanding on how the author is writing and what he's doing with his writing, that he's got a historical purpose and a typological purpose as he's presenting these events here. Okay, so I'm going to make a comment about Robin's commentary today, and which I always enjoy hearing. One thing I want you to know out of that, and Robin was spot on with the way she presented it to you, that when we're praying in the Spirit, when we're worshiping the Lord in spirit and truth, and we've died to self, and our mind is removed from the process, our mind doesn't shut down. It's still over there operating and thinking. It can be thinking about, like Robin said, the current events of the day, or you could even be thinking while you're praying in the Spirit. You can be thinking about the Lord or about things of the Lord and what you're doing. But the point is, your mind is still active. Here's the deal, and this is what's so important about New Covenant ministry, about the body of Christ, is that God is interested in your body. God is interested in the flesh. He wants to, in this end purpose of God's salvation plan, God uses the body of his children, of the disciples of Jesus Christ. He uses the body as an instrument of righteousness. So the flesh, the organs of speech, are being used by God in this process as instruments of righteousness. Our minds, removed from the process, yes, they're over here still actively thinking and still actively engaging because we're awake, we're not asleep. But those unknowable utterances that are coming out of our mouths through our organs of speech, we know experientially, oida knowledge, we know experientially. How? Because of the karpos fruit. Robin talked about, you'll know them by their fruit. Well, we're edified by the Lord, and so we can know experientially, and it's one of the beautiful things that comes over time as you pray in the Spirit. You gain confidence, and you gain, I guess you become emboldened, encouraged in the faith practice of spiritually spoken worship over time. One of the reasons, and you're going to see it in the passage here, in the epilogue passage, is because the Lord is edifying us. The Lord is feeding us out of that process of those unknowable utterances that have two purposes. One is judgment into the world, which is significantly for the realm of evangelism. And the second one is for the edification of the disciples who have been in the boat, so to speak, in this typology. They've been in that spiritual fellowship with the Lord. And the Lord prepares a meal for those who minister in the Spirit with him. He prepares a meal for them. We see that in the epilogue. And so that gives a sense for the karpos fruit that Robin talked about, that you'll know them by their fruit. And that doesn't have anything to do with the way we act out in the world. If we were judged by the way we act out in the world, we probably, if we were honest with ourselves, would be judged less than we think we're deserving of. We're all remain sin infected in our present walk out in the world, and our actions all fall short of the righteousness of God. We cannot, in the world, our flesh, our minds, we cannot attain to the righteousness of God because we're sin infected and we're in a dark sin infected world. So we can have edification from the Lord that reorders the way we think and influences how we think. But all of that is still sin infected. Is why it's exactly the reason that Jesus refers to it as unrighteous mammon. In chapter 16 of Luke, he talks about unrighteous mammon and being faithful ones with unrighteous mammon. How do you be a faithful one with unrighteous mammon? You be a faithful one with the edification that the Lord gives you, and it becomes the edification the Lord gives you. It's the knowledge of God, righteousness, but when it enters our mind, when it becomes our possession, it becomes mixed with our sin-infectedness. And so it becomes, at that point, unrighteous mammon. And that's exactly what Jesus is referring to when he says, I'll pull it from memory, if you won't be a faithful one with the unrighteous mammon, which is the edification from the Lord mixed in with our unrighteousness, if you won't be a faithful one in your unrighteous mammon, then who will entrust you with the true rhema? It's in Luke chapter 16. And so that's an idea of the karpos fruit. And when Jesus said you'll know them by their fruit in chapter 7 of Matthew, that's the Sermon on the Mount, he's speaking in the realm of false prophets. And he says you'll know them by their fruit. You'll know false prophets by their teaching. Their teaching comes out of their knowledge base. So that's their karpos fruit. And I say karpos fruit because there are two Greek terms for fruit. One is karpos. It has a very consistent vernacular meaning in the New Testament. Most often, karpos fruit is going to relate to knowledge. It relates all the way back to the Genesis story of the tree of the tree of life, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's going to be, where are you getting your fruit from? Where are you being edified from? And so when Jesus is talking about false prophets, and he said, you'll know them by their fruit, the idea there is you're going to know if a prophet is true or false based on what tree is he eating from. Is he eating from the tree of life, or is he eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? You'll know them by their fruit, by their karpos fruit. And when you eat from the tree of life, which you're going to see in this passage here, when Jesus feeds his disciples, that's a representation of eating from the tree of life. And you're either eating from the tree of life, which is the food Jesus has prepared for you. You're either eating from the tree of life or you're eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So Jesus, when he's talking about the false prophets in chapter 7 of Matthew, says you'll know them by their karpos fruit. What tree are they eating from? And here's how you'll know the difference. If the teaching of the prophet is not encouraging, exhorting, leading the disciples to the tree of life, it's not karpos fruit from the tree of life. If it's teaching that's not taking you back to the tree of life, it's karpos fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Because it's teaching, it's karpos fruit that's going to teach you to get to strive to attain to righteousness in your own efforts. In other words, it's the very meaning that has been misinterpreted in this term. You'll know them by their fruit. Has been misinterpreted, just like Robin said, of, well, just go out and do good. And if you're going out and do good, we'll recognize that as good fruit. But if I see you doing bad things, I'm going to recognize that as bad fruit. It takes it right into the realm of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Get your righteousness by going out into the world and doing good things. And that's how we'll know you. We'll judge you based on what we see you doing. It's the very opposite of the meaning intended by Jesus, is that there is no attaining to the righteousness of God by your own efforts, your mind, your strength, your efforts in the world. Ain't going to happen. You're always going to be sin infected and fall short of the righteousness of God. And so the tree of the tree of life is accessed in the dying to self, entering into that spiritual fellowship, out of which Jesus prepares a meal off of the tree of life. He is the tree of life. And so that meal that we get from Jesus is going to become our karpos fruit. It's what we get edified with. It's what we eat. The meal prepared by Jesus is from the karpos fruit from the tree of life. And that's where we attain to the righteousness of God, died to self, in that spiritual fellowship. That's the attainment of the righteousness of God into it, in that punctiliar season. When you come back out, you're back in your own sin infectedness, but you've received karpos fruit from the tree of life, edification. We're going to see that in the epilogue here. So when Jesus says, speaking about false prophets, he says, you'll know them by their karpos fruit. You'll recognize karpos fruit, it's knowledge that is being represented in teaching. We're talking about false prophets there. There's another word for teachers. We're talking about teachers. So you'll know the teaching, if it's the teaching, a karpos fruit of a false prophet, based on this. Is it leading people back to the tree of life? If the teaching of the prophet or the teaching of the pastor teacher, whatever you want to call them, if the teaching is not encouraging, exhorting, leading the children of God back to the tree of life, back to Jesus, into his presence, if that's not the primary purpose and motivation of the teaching, if that's not what is motivating, enlivening, inspiring the teaching, then Jesus is saying that's how you're going to know the difference between a false prophet and a true prophet. A prophet who is operating off of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, self-righteousness, go out in the world and do good, be good, that's how we're going to judge you, or the tree of life. That God is the only source of righteousness, and the only access to the righteousness of God is to come into the presence of the Lord Jesus Christ out of the dying to self according to the obedience from faith. And that's where we receive the good karpos, which is going to help us, assist us, edify us to be teachers or prophets that will motivate, inspire, encourage, exhort, teach the children of God to come into the presence of Jesus, to come to the tree of life. You'll know them by their karpos fruit. Okay, well, the other kind of fruit is the ganema fruit, and you only see that with one exception in Paul's writings, but you only see that in the teaching on the Lord's Supper in the three synoptics. They all refer just in those three locations, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. When Jesus is giving the Lord's Supper, he refers to Ganema fruit, not karpos fruit, ganema fruit. Ganema is a cognate to the verb ginomai. That's the verb of creation, to make or to become. Ganema is the noun, the cognate noun to the verb of creation, ganema. So, or ginomai, ginomai. And the noun is ganema, translated as fruit in those Lord Supper passages in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so ganema fruit, we've talked about karpos fruit, right? That's the knowledge that we possess being edified from the Lord, or the knowledge of the world, which is from a different tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but that's karpos fruit. Ganema fruit, from the verb ginomai, which is the verb of creation, ganema fruit is the term that represents the rhema, the spoken rhema word of Christ. Those unknowable utterances are being referenced with the noun ganema, translated fruit. So in my translations in Stauros, I differentiate that by calling it ganema hyphen fruit, so that when you're reading it, you're triggered automatically. Oh, this is the ganema fruit. It's only found here in the Lord's Supper. It refers to those unknowable spoken utterances out of this spiritual fellowship. All of these things tie together in Scripture, church. So it's good for you to be aware that the term fruit in the Lord's Supper is a different word that has meaning in the context of the creative working of God. That when you're partaking of the Lord's Supper in his end purpose, in the spiritual fellowship with Jesus Christ, speaking with the Lord, speaking those unknowable utterances, you're releasing creative power of God into the world. And so that's ganema fruit. The ganema fruit of the vine. Jesus is the vine. This is the ganema fruit of the vine being released into the world. And so there you can kind of see the context where God's interested in our bodies. Contrary to a lot of heresy in the ancient world, specifically in Gnosticism, that really demonized the flesh, that the flesh is the source of evil. No, the flesh is not the source of evil. The sin-infected mind is the source of evil. The sin-infected mind is the gate to Hades that Jesus referred to in Matthew 16, verse 18, when he said that on this rock, revelation from the Father of who I am, on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of Hades will not come against it. Why? Because Jesus building his church, he only operates in those disciples who've died to self and removed their mind from the process. And so that's why I can be speaking those unknowable utterances. It's a matter of faith. I know that those are from Jesus by the working of the Holy Spirit coming through my flesh being released into the world. They're unknowable to my mind. So my mind is still operating over here, but my mind is removed from that process that's taking place by the mind of Christ, by the working of the Holy Spirit, through my organs of speech, through my body of flesh. God is using my flesh as, and yours when you're doing this, as an instrument of righteousness, the true, genuine, pure, perfect, unadulterated truth of God, knowledge of God, righteousness of God, holiness, perfection of God, streaming out of your mouth in those unknowable utterances. And so our mind, removed from this process, is unfruitful. We don't understand, we don't comprehend what those utterances are, what they're for, the assignments that are on them. Only God knows, and they will all be fulfilled. And the beautiful thing is, we'll see this in the epilogue passage, some of those assignments are for us. And that's represented in the epilogue by Jesus standing on the shore, preparing a fish and bread on a charcoal fire. That's some of those utterances that are released are for us, for our edification. Karpos, fruit. Paul calls it in Philippians chapter 1, it's in the passage verses 9 through 11. He calls it karpos, fruit of righteousness, because it's from God. Karpos, fruit of righteousness. It becomes mixed with our unrighteousness, which is why, again, Jesus calls it unrighteous mammon. It was righteous mammon when Jesus was preparing it, but when we consumed it and it became our possession in our sin-infected mind, it became unrighteous mammon, but nevertheless mammon from the tree of life. Karpos, fruit from the tree of life. You will know them by their fruit. Those of us that understand the true doctrine, worship God in spirit and in truth, are passionate about talking about God's salvation plan, encouraging the children of God. This is for you. If you have faith to believe, this is for you. You're an invited one. You have faith. That's your ticket. That's your authority. That's all you need. You don't need anything else. If you have faith to believe, given from the Father, given by the Father, if you have faith to believe, you have everything you need to enter into that spiritual realm and participate in God's salvation plan and enjoy the benefits, the after benefit of it, of being edified by the Lord himself. Faith is all it takes. There's not a separate special class of Christians that get to do that. Christians that will enter into the spiritual realm of fellowship with the Father and his Son Jesus Christ are operating in the faith that they receive from the Father. That's the ticket. That's the authority. Okay. So let's get back into the text here. And I am going to try and wrap this up today because I have something else I want to get into next week. I'd like to move into a different part of the Gospel of John. The overall mission is still the first epistle, the Epistle of John. But these things are so important and so illuminating into the author of this gospel and the first epistle of John. They're so illuminating to take these detours into his gospel that when we come back to his first epistle, 1 John, we're going to know a lot more and really have a lot deeper understanding of what he's writing and what he's doing in his first epistle. We get this foundation broadened with the words and the ministry of Jesus in the fourth gospel. So I want to move into, it's actually a passage in chapter 8, and talk about that, where Jesus himself has such an amazing words, brief, but an amazing representation of God's salvation plan in the words of Jesus. And you can really then, through the words of Jesus, gain so much more understanding into what's happening in the Pauline epistles, what's happening in the Johannine epistles. When you grasp and understand these things that Jesus is saying and doing in the Gospels as he's interacting with his young disciples and the Pharisees and that whole world, gives you a tremendous insight into this two-dimensional plan of salvation, faith to believe, and then the end purpose into the obedience from faith. The words of Jesus. Jesus is the founder of the doctrine, not Paul. And you can see that when you understand the words of Jesus in the gospel. So I want to get into a different part of the Gospel of John, chapter 8, and talk about a couple of passages there where the salvation plan of God in this present age of the new covenant just explodes out of the words that he's using in this interaction. It's fascinating. I want to get there next week. Okay, so we talked last week, we finished up where they drug the net full of fish to the shore, and the disciple whom Jesus was loving said to Peter, "It's the Lord," right? They hadn't previously known, right? Earlier, they said, Jesus stood on the shore. This is verse 4. However, the disciples had not actually known that it was Jesus. So they hadn't known that it was Jesus. Then they do their fishing by the command of Jesus, and they catch this net full of fish. And all of a sudden, the one disciple, the disciple whom Jesus was loving, suddenly had revelation. He had been given a karpos fruit, word of knowledge, to know who that man is standing on the shore. And he said, "It's the Lord." So the relation there, that revelation, "It's the Lord," is to when they're in the boat fishing on the sea, representing speaking in tongues. When a disciple is speaking in tongues, spiritually spoken service of worship, Spirit-empowered prayers of unknowable utterances, worship to the Father in spirit and truth. These are all biblical terms for what's being represented by the boat on the Sea of Galilee. That they hadn't known that it was Jesus, but afterwards, the one disciple, Jesus is loving him. He receives a karpos fruit, word of knowledge, revelation, that he now recognizes and knows that it's Jesus on the shore. That's what's being represented there. And what happens here? Let's pick up there. In verse 7, I'm going to read the passage and then I'm going to talk about it. Verses 7 and 8 is the passage titled, "It's the Lord." Do you have it? Yeah, I want it to be up when I read it. It's the Lord. Verse 7, "Therefore the disciple whom Jesus was loving said to Peter, 'It's the Lord.' Then Peter, after hearing that, 'It's the Lord,' girded himself about with his outer garment, for he was naked, and threw himself into the sea. But the other disciples came in the little boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards. Let's talk about that. What is going on here? I mean, absent the historical event, which is simple enough in the way it's being represented, what the heck is going on with Peter? That they catch a net full of fish, and he's naked, and he gets up and puts his robe on and dives into the sea. What is being represented there? Here's what you need to ask there. What's the typology? What is the author of this gospel representing here about ministry, about the new covenant age of faith, the church age? What's being represented here with Peter, who was naked, putting on his outer robe and throwing himself into the sea? Now, the common understanding of that has been this, and I'm going to tell you up front, it's just wrong because the text doesn't say it. It's been interpreted like, well, certainly Peter has to be so excited about hearing that it's the Lord that he just can't even wait for them to row to get to the shore. He's got to get there faster, sooner, and he just, in his exuberance, dove into the water And he doesn't want to go and be undressed before the Lord, so he puts his robe on, and he's just going to do a breaststroke into the shore, get there as fast as he can. Well, the text not only doesn't say that, but explicitly represents something different than that. So I want you to, if you can, take that historical teaching and put a big X on it. Peter is not motivated to get to the Lord fast. He's not all excited and exuberant that it's the Lord, and he just can't help himself. He's so excited. What's being represented here is denial. What's being represented here is betrayal. This is the typology. They're in the boat. When you remove your mind from the process in the end purpose, you are in the truest sense coming naked before the Lord. To be naked before the Lord is to leave your judgments, your opinions at home, away. They're sin infected. They've got no place before the Lord. They're unrighteous. They're sin infected. Yes, church, our opinions, our judgments, our thinking is sin infected and has no place before the Lord. So when we remove our mind from the process in this end purpose, when we figuratively, in the context of the typology in the epilogue, when we onboard into the boat and go upon the sea, not in the sea, but we go upon the sea, we have removed our mind from the process. We are naked before God. That's what it means to be naked before God. That's what it means in Genesis 3, when God asked the first man, Adam, after the fall. He asked him, "Who told you you were naked?" See, prior to transgressing, Adam transgressed. Eve was deceived. Adam transgressed. Prior to his transgression, Adam was existing in a state of nakedness before God. When he transgressed and ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they covered themselves with fig leaves, right? They covered themselves with fig leaves. It's not like God didn't know the answer to the question, who told you you were naked? Well, that comes from the evil one, who said, you can eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and you can become like God, knowing good from evil. You can have your own covering. You're not naked before God anymore, dependent on His judgment, on His fruit, His ideas, His judgments, His opinions. You can have your own judgment and your own opinion. And so that's what it means in the boat when the beloved disciple says, "It's the Lord." And Peter's first reaction, catch this, church, is to cover himself with fig leaves. He's doing exactly what the first man did in the garden when they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They covered themselves with fig leaves. So they're in the boat, and the beloved disciple says, "It's the Lord," in response to speaking in tongues, and Peter puts his robe on, covers himself, covers his nakedness, right? So he's no longer naked before the Lord, and he throws himself into the sea, into the world. What all is being represented there by John? What's the meta-narrative? What's the overall narrative that's being represented by John? And you can know what it is through the writings of Paul, where Peter had become influenced and sucked into the other euangelion, the Judaized euangelion at Jerusalem, where the Jewish church at Jerusalem had synchronized with Moses. And Paul calls that the other euangelion. And that is not from the tree of the knowledge, from the tree of life. That's from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The other euangelion, the syncretized Christianity with Judaism, which would become reflected later in the church at Rome. I've talked about that. But this is what's being represented here. What John very briefly, very succinctly, very typologically is representing here is that Peter is essentially going to, for a season, a long season, for about at least 20 years. We can know that because it began about AD 43 when Peter was jailed. The Apostle James was martyred. Peter was jailed, and through the miraculous work of an angel, he escaped from prison. And the next time we see him, he is at Antioch, and Paul is coming face to face against Peter because Peter has been intimidated by these Jewish Christians from James who've come up to Antioch from Jerusalem and are teaching, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And so all these Gentiles at Antioch that were uncircumcised, this contingent from Jerusalem was saying, you can't associate with them. And so Peter became aloof and distanced from them. And the first thing Paul did was go face to face with Peter and say, Peter, and he uses the word katagenosko, and it has the meaning, the connotation of, you know better. Peter, you know better than this. But for probably something on the order of 20 years, Peter would remain influenced by what Paul called the other, the heteros euangelion, the other gospel that was being ministered out of Jerusalem, was taught in all the churches of Judea. And then many of the churches in the diaspora that had strong synagogues where there was a Christian sect, that's the tradition that would infiltrate those church communities. That happened with the church at Rome. This is what John, writing at the end of the first century, is representing here in this picture of Peter when he hears, it's the Lord, about speaking in tongues. It's the Lord, which was so hated by the Jews of Jerusalem. They hated this idea that speaking in tongues, spiritually spoken worship to the Father in spirit and in truth, that was replacing the entire Old Covenant, temple-centered Jewish religion. Everything had to be reinterpreted through this weird, fantastic, mysterious, whatever word you want to put on it, realm of spiritual worship to God, speaking in tongues. Everything that the Jews had known and revered according to the customs of Moses was going to end with the cross. When Jesus said, "It has been fulfilled," all of that is surpassed by this spiritual fellowship with Jesus Christ, speaking in tongues. That's what's being represented here in the picture where the beloved disciple says, "It's the Lord." And Peter immediately covers himself and dives into the world. Okay? So let's pick up on the story here. Yes. Oh, wait, no, go back, Robin, to 7 and 8. So Jesus girded himself with his outer garment, for he was naked. He's no longer naked. The outer garment has the same meaning as the fig leaves on the first man and woman in Genesis chapter 3. He covered himself. It represents self-righteousness. He dives, it represents syncretization with Judaism. Take his revelation, his faith, and syncretize it with the self-righteousness of Judaism. He covered his nakedness, covered himself, and left this heavenly realm in the presence of the Lord and went straight into the world. And that's where Peter would stay, associated with the heteros euangelion, the other euangelion, the Judaized gospel. He would stay in the world, in the Sea of Tiberias, for something on the order of 20 years. And we can know that Peter came back into the full gospel because we have 1 Peter and 2 Peter that were written in the middle of the AD 60s. Something on the order of 20 years after he got sucked into the Judaized tradition, something on the order of 20 years later, and I think very much from the influence of the Apostle Paul and the writings of the Apostle Paul, Peter came back to the full gospel. You'll see all this represented in the epilogue. Came back to the full gospel, and our proof that he came back to the full gospel is 1 Peter and 2 Peter, that are very representative of Pauline doctrine. Very close in terminology, in message. So you can know that late in Peter's life, before he was martyred, he got it. He came back. He got it. He understood. And he was walking again in the full gospel. Amazing history. John, writing at the end of the first century, a full generation after all of that, is representing that in his epilogue here. And so Peter diving in is falling away, is becoming sucked into the Judaized heteros euangelion of the Jews in Jerusalem, the Jewish believing community in Jerusalem. That James represents in Acts chapter 21, when Paul comes back after being in Corinth and writing the book of Romans. He makes his last visit to Jerusalem, comes to James, presents the offering from the Gentiles, and the first thing James says to him, "You see, Brother Paul, how many thousands of brothers," those are Christians, "of brothers are zealous for Moses." So all the way 25 years after the cross in Jerusalem, they are practicing in the heteros euangelion, a Judaized euangelion. This is what is being represented by Peter covering himself, diving into the sea, into the world. John is essentially saying here that this heteros euangelion in Jerusalem was a worldly tradition, a tradition of men. Paul writes in Galatians chapter 5 that that tradition is far away, removed from Christ. They're still Christian in terms of they have faith to believe. They're spirit-regenerated Christians, but their faith has become corrupted. They've been deceived. They've syncretized Moses with the true faith, and the faith has become corrupted. It's now is nothing other than a worldly religion. They have Christ in name only, but in practice, in reality, it's simply become a worldly religion. That's Peter diving into the water. He's not all excited about Jesus on the shore. He's denying Jesus. He is betraying Jesus. And he's diving into the world. And that's where he would be for some 20 years. That's the story here. That's the typology being represented here. And then in verse 8, but the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far away from the land, only about 100 yards. So what is being represented here? We know the boat is that spiritual realm of fellowship with God, with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. Worship to the Father in spirit and truth. Spiritually spoken worship, speaking in tongues. That's the boat. That's above the world. That's on top of the world. The sea is the world, the dark, sin-infected world that's still ruled by Satan. Often in the Old Testament, the sea was referred to as the abyss. That's what's being represented by the sea. So what's the land? The land is representing the physical fellowship of believers. And so these disciples that stayed in the boat, not far from the land, is basically saying that the physical fellowship of believers is not the spiritual fellowship with God, but they're not far apart. They're near together because it's out of that physical fellowship where we teach about the spiritual fellowship and encourage believers out of the physical fellowship to go into the spiritual fellowship. This physical fellowship is not far from the spiritual fellowship. That's what's being represented here by the boat going then to the land, because it's not far from the land. John is representing the typology there of the spiritual fellowship and the physical fellowship. So they're leaving the spiritual fellowship having evangelized. They have a net full of fish, and they're going back to land, to the physical fellowship of believers. Amazing typology that is represented so briefly here. Okay, now, Robin, we'll go into the next passage, which I call the Great High Priest, starting with verse 9. I'm going to read verses 9 and 11. Then, as they deboarded onto the land, leave the spiritual fellowship back into the physical fellowship. As they deboarded onto the land, they see a charcoal fire being laid out and a fish being laid upon it and bread. And Jesus says to them, "Bear this one away from the fish that you now caught." Then Simon Peter ascends onto the land, and he dragged the net full of fish onto the land. 153. And with reference to their being so large, the net was not torn. Gosh, there's so much going on in this passage. So let's start. I said I want to try and get through all of this, so let's just keep going. So they deboarded onto the land. You already know the typology there. They deboarded out of spiritually spoken worship back into, I'm operating with my mind, back in the physical fellowship of the world. Of the church, right? They're both separate from the world. The spiritual fellowship with God, which is represented as above the world, and the land, which is represented alongside the world as the physical fellowship. You see the typology? I want you to visually see this in your mind. One is above the spiritual fellowship, floating on the sea, and the other one is alongside the world as the dry land, representing the physical fellowship of believers. This is where they're moving from and to. And so they're dragging, as they go to the shore, this net full of fish to the land with them. So the representation there is that these are new believers, right? You know that. The fish, that's the typology there. That's not a hard one. The fish in the net, that are caught up in the net, are being represented as being constrained, now contained by faith given to them. And they're being dragged to the shore. But he represents it with reference to their being so large, the net was not torn. Amazing typology there relating to the eternal security of believers, of spirit-regenerated believers, of redeemed children of God. There's been a lot of bad teaching and a lot of bad theology in the church that says, well, you can have faith, but you can also go out and sin so badly and so egregiously that you fall away from the salvation plan of God. You're just lost in the world again. You are no longer a child of God. You have forfeited your salvation. You're no longer in the club. That's what's been taught in much of the church, and that is an abomination. That is a lie straight out of the pit of hell. Here's the truth. Here's the reality of the Scriptures. This is Scripture. It's replete in the Scriptures. If you'll not pluck out proof text to try and read into the text something that's not there. The holistic reading of the New Testament is this. When God sovereignly gives a human being faith to believe, and they're redeemed, they are new creations. They are creations of God. You don't opt in and out of that. The testimony of Scriptures is by the working of God, unmerited to you. You did nothing to deserve it. It is entirely to God's credit and to His ability that He gives faith to believe that you're a new creation. What? A creation of God. A child of God. You were a child of this world. Now you are a child of God. A new creation. And Jesus says, nobody can pluck you out of my hand. Nobody. Nothing. Read the end of chapter 8 of Romans. That final passage in Romans, if you want to know how effective God's working is, God's creative power to change a sinful, rebellious enemy of God into a child of God. Read the last passage of Romans chapter 8. It's always good to refresh yourself on that. How effective God's working is to keep us and to hold us in the net. The net was not torn. And torn by what? And often the reading here is that there were so many fish in the net. I don't read it that way. You can. That's not necessarily wrong, right? They tell us that there's 153 fish, so there's really no need to tell us that there's so many fish. So along with 153, he tells us how many there are, 153. We already know that's a lot. He then gives us a little more information. Out of there, and it's a really unusual word there that means so much, so many, or, and I think this is the right meaning, so large. So we know there's 153. Out of there being so large, the net didn't tear. See, they could have been tiny little fish that there would have been extra room in this net. But there were 153, and out of there being so large, the net did not tear. So what's being represented by this 153? They're new believers, and out of there being so large, the net didn't tear. They weren't lost. They were held securely in, even though they were still in the world, right? They're not spiritual worshipers of God. They're still in the world. Yet they're redeemed. They have faith to believe. They're contained by the net. They're children of God. They are separated from the world even though they're in the world in this net. And the net, even though they're so large, doesn't break. Here's what's represented there. They're still, these 153 new believers, like Peter, they're still wearing their own covering. They're still covered by fig leaves. They're still very large, puffed up in their own image. They've not done what John the Baptist said, I must decrease and he must increase. No, they were still big, large, voluminous in their judgments and their opinions. That's what's being represented in this unusual term here that he says 153, yet out of their being so large, the net didn't break. Meaning even though they're still sin-infected, they've not yet learned to humble themselves and come before the Lord naked, to release their mind from the process and come naked before the Lord, to become nothing before the Lord so that the Lord can use their flesh. They've not learned that yet. So out of their being so large, puffed up in their own minds, yet, John writes, this is important, church, not a single one of them was lost. The net never tore. Their faith to believe, their redemption, they are new creations. None was lost back to the world. They all stayed contained in the net, even though they're still in the world. They're still immersed down into the sea, which is where Peter is now, right? Doesn't tell us what Peter's doing. He's just in the world. So don't think he's down there, ministering to the fish. That's not what's represented here. He's just in the world. But this 153 fish that were so large couldn't tear the net and break loose. The net stayed secure. Not a single one was lost. Not one, church. Not one out of the 153 that were caught in the net. Not a single one was lost. Not one. So we have to get over this bad tradition and bad teaching in the church that would teach the children of God that, watch out, because if you sin, you can end up sinning so bad that you're no longer in God's salvation plan. You are no longer part of God's community, God's family. You've lost your status as a child of God, and you're just one of Satan's household again. Bad teaching and bad tradition, and it's absolutely refuted here in the epilogue by this one little reference to 153, which is the number derived out of the number for victory. The number for victory in the Old Testament is the number 17. You can study that on your own. But the number 17 is a representation of victory. That's what's being represented here. How? 153 is if I can use a mathematical term, it's a triangular number for 17, where you have 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5, all the way down to plus 17. That's a triangular number, equals 153. That's what's being represented here in this harvest of new believers. 153 is being represented, the victory of God, the harvest of new believers, new creations that are now contained by the faith given them by God. That net of faith is never going to tear, to the extent that those fish can escape back into the world, where they become part of the household of Satan again. They will always, even though they're in the world, they're contained by this net called faith. They are new creation. They are in the world, but they are separated from the world, and they belong to God, children of God, who can never escape that net and enter back into the household of Satan, In the world, yes, just like Peter went back into the world, but never again belonging to the world. Now, by faith, new creations. Now, even though you're in the world, you belong to God. That's what's represented here. And the net, John, the Apostle John, you can trust this, church. The Apostle John writes, the net did not tear, even though they were so large. They were so big in their own minds. They thought that they were so smart, so knowledgeable, that John says, even in spite of that, which, by the way, that's the worst of sins before God, is to depend on yourself, your self-righteousness, your efforts, just like Peter did when he covered himself with fig leaves and dove back into the world. Not a one was lost. So important to catch that here. So easy to move past that. What does that mean, the net didn't tear? It means that God's salvation plan, when he gives faith to believe, and a human being becomes a new creation, they are eternally secure as children of God, even though they're still in the world, even though they're still sinning in the world, even though they will not come into or have not come into the end purpose of God's salvation plan. Even though they might not even be part of the genuine physical fellowship of believers. They may be wandering in the world by themselves. If God has given them faith, if God has made them new creations, they are eternally secure regardless, no matter what. That's what's being represented here by the net that did not tear, regardless of how big those fish were inside the net. Okay, I want to talk about Jesus says to them. Robin, if you can put that back up, the great high priest. Jesus says to them, bear this one away from the fish that you now caught. Now, here's what's important about this. Look in your English translation, and here's what you're going to see. You're going to see something to the effect, Jesus said, hey, bring some of those fish over here. Right? Look in your English translation. Important that you see that. It's represented as Jesus, as they're getting out of the boat onto the land, and they see the fish and the bread on the charcoal fire. Right? And Jesus says to them, bear this one away from the fish that you now caught. In your translation, your English translation, will say, Jesus said to them, bring some of those fish over here. I don't have enough for you. Bring some more of those so that I can cook more than the one that I've got here on the fire. Right? Jesus, it says in the previous verse 9, that the disciples saw a charcoal fire being laid out and a fish, one fish. Verse 9, you'll see that in your translation. One fish being laid on the charcoal fire. Just one. Right? There are 153 in the fire, but now there's just one on the charcoal fire. And so English translations have rendered verse 10 as saying, hey, Jesus is saying, hey, disciples, bring some of those fish over here. I've only got one. I need some more. That's not what's happening here. Jesus says to them, the verb is pharaoh, to carry, to bear. Bear this one away from the fish that you now caught. I have this one in italics because the text doesn't say that. But it's singular. Jesus is referring to the one fish that the text has already said is on the fire. There's one fish on the fire. It's separate from those other 153. Jesus is referring, when he says, uses the verb pharaoh, bear, he's referring to this fish that he has on the fire. And he's not suggesting, say, hey, you might want to think about eating this fish here on the fire. No, he's commanding them. It's an imperative. Bear it. And so, you bear it as in it's a burden to carry, not a heavy burden, right? Jesus' yoke is light. It's not a heavy burden. But nevertheless, when Jesus edifies you, it's always going to be for the purpose of ministry. And ministry is always going to be for the purpose to bring believers to the tree of life. Always. It's a circle. That you come to the tree of life, you get edified for ministry. Ministry is to come back to the tree of life, and it's just a circular pattern. That's faith life under the new covenant. And so Jesus is saying here in very literal words translation, without this one, he says, bear, he leaves the direct object silent. Bear what? Well, he doesn't say. But the text has just referenced one fish on the fire where Jesus is cooking. Jesus says, bear away from the fish that you now caught. So you can know by the prepositional phrase that has apa, away from, you can know that something is referenced here in the direct object that is separate and away from the 153 fish that are in the net. He even confirms that in the next verse where it's Peter dragging the net out of the water. So we can know from that he's talking about the fish that's on the fire. One fish, separate from the 153 new believers. There's a fish on the fire Jesus is prepared for his disciples. He says, come, eat a meal, in verse 12. Robin, you want to go to the next passage? Jesus feeds his disciples, verses 12 through 14. Jesus says to them, come, eat a meal. But none of the disciples was daring to inquire, who are you? Because they knew experientially that it's the Lord. That had already been, just like with the beloved disciple, that had been revealed to them. It's the Lord. Jesus comes and takes the bread and gives it to them, and likewise the fish. This was now the third time Jesus manifested to the disciples after being raised up from the dead. So let's talk about verse 12. Jesus says to them, right, okay, we already know that the disciples deboarded out of the boat onto the land, spiritual fellowship back into the physical fellowship, onto the land, and now, now they know they get to eat. Why? Because they see a meal being prepared, a fish and bread on a charcoal fire. It's their turn to eat. They're done working, servicing the Lord, the service of worship to the Lord. Now they get to eat. It's in the physical fellowship, edification from the Lord. The meal the Lord prepares is always for the physical fellowship, for the sake of physical fellowship, for teaching, for encouragement, for exhorting, for correction, to always bring the children of God back to Jesus in the spiritual fellowship. That's represented on the land. Now it's represented in the fish and the bread on the charcoal fire, where Jesus says in verse 12, come, eat a meal. Now let's talk about the meal. It's a very special kind of word for a meal that indicates a secondary meal of the day, the minor meal of the day. And you can kind of get a sense for the difference here in the story in Luke, where Jesus talks about the disciple comes in from the field, girds himself, and feeds the master a meal. And it's only when the master is finished eating, right? Jesus says he doesn't get to recline with the master. No, he's a servant. He feeds the master. And it's after that this servant feeds the master, right? So that represents one meal. After the servant services the master, the main meal, the deipnon, then afterwards the servant gets to eat. That's what's being represented here by this word for a secondary meal. Different than deipnon, the main meal. Deipnon, by the way, is the word that John, the author of the fourth gospel, he uses that same term relative to the meal in the upper room in chapter 13. He calls it the deipnon. Deipnon refers to the main meal of the day. Sometimes it means banquet. It means it's a big event. It's the big meal of the day. It's the big one. In fact, it might even be a banquet feast. Deipnon. And so, in contrast to that, John is using the other word here on the lips of Jesus, that this is not a deipnon, this is not the main meal of the day, this is the secondary meal, and has the connotation possibly of breakfast, maybe lunch, but the literal meaning for the term that Jesus uses here is the minor meal of the day. It's a lesser meal to the main meal of the day. So the main meal of the day is being represented by that 153 fish that are caught up in the net. That's the meal for the Lord. New believers. The house of the strong man in this world, plundered by someone stronger, now contained in the net that they can't get loose. That's the deipnon. When you participate in the Lord's Supper, the deipnon, it's for the evangelism of the lost in the world. That's the deipnon. That's the main meal. That's the service of worship to God, is represented by the 153 new believers in that net. And when they're done with that and they leave the spiritual fellowship with God and service of worship to God, servicing the master, feeding the master, then they get to eat the minor secondary meal. That's what Jesus is representing here. Come, eat a meal. I could paraphrase Jesus. Come and eat the secondary minor meal. You've already participated in the deipnon, the main meal of the day. Now I've got something for you. I've got for you now the minor meal. Come, eat a meal, Jesus says to them. Get my place here. But none of the disciples daring to inquire to Jesus, "Who are you?" knowing experientially that it's the Lord. You see the tie here between eat a meal, revelation, edification. That's what the typology that the author here, John, the fourth evangelist, is representing here in verse 11, it's verse 12, in the epilogue. Come eat a meal. The disciples all knew knowledge, karpos, fruit from the tree of life. They all knew that it's Jesus. How do you know it's karpos fruit? Because it's Jesus. And it's what's going to cause you then to talk about coming back to Jesus. That was when we were on the boat, when we were in spiritual fellowship, when we're speaking those unknowable utterances, it's the Lord. And when you participate in that, you gain in confidence and experiential knowledge, revelation, edification, that you grow deeper and stronger in your faith, that when you're worshiping in spirit and truth, and when you're releasing those unknowable utterances, it's the Lord. Those are utterances from His eternal throne in the heavenlies, brought to earth by the working and power of the Holy Spirit through our bodies, through our flesh, that has now become an instrument of righteousness for God, so that the net of faith can catch a full harvest. That's the main meal of the day. Now, the author, on the lips of Jesus, is representing edification from the Lord that comes out of that. That you can know that some of those unknowable utterances, they're for you. The Lord has some of those that are going to become the fish and bread on the charcoal fire. And I want you to see there on the charcoal fire, I want you to see there the great high priest inside the Holy of Holies, where the burning hot coals are brought in from the sacrifice, right? The sacrifice on the brazen altar on the outside of the temple, where the animal is killed and consumed in fire. Then the priests, in their censers, they get some of the hot coals, the hottest coals from that fire, from that sacrifice, and they put them in their censers, and they bring them to the inside of the sanctuary of the temple, where the high priest is ministering at the golden altar, and they put those coals on the golden altar, and the priest, the high priest, pours perfumed oil on those coals, and a cloud of perfumed smoke rises toward God. It's holy, fragrant aroma to God. This is spiritually spoken worship. This is all of that Old Testament, Old Covenant temple pageantry was all foreshadowing the new covenant worship in spirit and in truth. And I want you to see here that when you see Jesus ministering at a charcoal fire, I want you to see the great high priest who's still ministering to his people today. The great high priest is feeding the people. Jesus is feeding his disciples today, church. Today. He is the fulfillment of that typology from the Old Testament. The Old Covenant, Mosaic, Levitical priesthood that ministered inside the inner sanctum of the temple at the golden altar was always foreshadowing, always pointing toward what John is representing here in the post-resurrection Jesus on the shore, which the land represents the physical fellowship of believers, that Jesus is ministering into that physical fellowship, giving edification, strengthening faith, giving revealed knowledge, so that the church, the children of God, can be edified and encouraged and exhorted to come back into the spiritual worship and into His presence. It's a circle where they come out of and they get edified, they eat again. Go back in, feed the main meal to the master, come back out, get fed a minor meal from the master. And on and on. That is life in the present age of the new covenant. That's the scriptural story of the entire New Testament, being succinctly, very briefly, very typologically represented by John here in the epilogue. Jesus says to them, "Come eat a meal." Okay, verse 13, he says, Jesus comes and takes the bread, gives it to them, and the fish likewise. It's Jesus Himself in the midst of the physical fellowship, out of those rhema spoken in the spiritual fellowship, that some of that is for the disciples, for them, for the benefit of the physical fellowship of believers. And that's what we're doing right now, church. Right now, in this moment, as you're listening, as I'm teaching, this is the physical fellowship of believers. Out of the karpos fruit, out of the fish and the bread, out of the edification from the Lord. Then we have physical fellowship where we teach and we encourage the children of God to come into the presence of the Lord. If you have faith to believe, you're invited. Come into the presence of the Lord. It's the one thing. It's the one thing, church, that God wants, desires, expects, commands from His children. The one thing. That is the realm of loving God with all of your heart, soul, and mind. That is the realm, if you can see now in the typology, that is the realm of loving one another. Because it's out of this realm of spiritual fellowship that the lost are evangelized and the children of God are edified. That's loving one another. So the children of God that enter into this end purpose of God's salvation plan, there and only there are you fulfilling the commandments of God. There is the fulfillment of the law, Romans 10:4. In the presence of Jesus Christ, the righteous one, the perfect one. That's the fulfillment. Okay. Verse, where is Peter? There's something I want to talk about. Verse 11. Then Simon Peter, I'm going back, Robin. Then Simon Peter ascended onto the land, and he dragged the net full of large fish onto the land. Okay? The disciples have already deboarded. They've already seen the meal. They're already on the land. Paul is represented here as after that, then he comes out of the sea, out of the world. And we can see here being represented that, yes, Peter went into the world for a season, and he did. That's represented in Acts. It's represented in Galatians. We can see this Antioch incident and know that Paul had got sucked into this heteros euangelion, or Peter had gotten sucked into this heteros euangelion. But John shows us here in verse 11, Peter coming out of the world, ascending. The word is anabaino, ascending out of the abyss of the sea and onto the land into the genuine physical fellowship of believers. Peter's back. He's returned. And having returned, then he can participate with the other disciples in getting the fish to the land. Because you notice that Peter's not represented doing anything for the new catch until he ascends back on the land. All we see him is he disappears into the sea. He covers himself with fig leaves, covers his nakedness, dives back into the world, and we don't see Peter again until John has him ascending onto the dry land of the physical fellowship. And then we see Peter doing something to minister to those new believers. So don't infer here. It would be wrong to infer, wrong to the typology, wrong to the story that's being told, to think that, Peter is just down in the world ministering to the fish where they are. No, that's not what John's representing here. He's just representing them as they're just all in the world. But he lets us know that Peter returns. Sometime later, Peter returns. He comes back onto the dry land, and then we see him. He's ministering to the new believers, to the what Jesus called, what John called in his first epistle, teknion, little children. They were not yet matured in their faith. When Peter ascends back onto the dry land, then he's seen ministering to the little children, the new believers. That's the typology. That's what's being represented here. So don't read into that, well, Peter was just in another part doing the dirty work that nobody else wanted to do. Don't walk away with that wrong meaning here. The only thing that you can infer from the typology is that Peter went back into the world, and he was just in the world with the other euangelion, which we can know by correlating with other parts of the New Testament. And that at some point, and John can know, right? Because he's writing all the way at the end of the first century. So he has hindsight. At some point, Peter ascends out of the water. Did this all happen? I think it did. I think that John is representing a historical event, but you have to know and you have to understand he is representing it to so that it has typological meaning about ministry during the age of the New Covenant, including the fact that Peter left the genuine gospel of Christ and became affiliated with that heteros euangelion that was promoted out of Jerusalem. And this is an amazing depiction here in verse 11 that Peter does indeed at some point ascend out of the abyss, out of the world, onto the dry land of genuine fellowship with the church, ministering to the new believers. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. There's too much to say in the next passage, which I've titled New Covenant Ministry. I'm going to read it and then save it for next week. Robin, if you can put up New Covenant Ministry starting at verse 15. This is an amazing passage, again, filled with a lot of folklore, if you will, in church teaching. So it's important that I walk through this passage here in enough detail that we can understand what's happening in this strange passage. Verse 15, therefore, after they ate a meal, Jesus says to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you agape love me more than these? He says to him, Peter says to Jesus, yes, Lord, you know experientially that I philo love you. Jesus says to Peter, tend my lambs. Jesus says to him again a second time, Simon, son of John, do you agape love me? Peter says to Jesus, yes, Lord, you know experientially that I philo love you. Jesus says to him, shepherd my sheep. Verse 17. Jesus says to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you philo love me? See the shift there? Do you philo love me? Peter was grieved that he said to him the third time, do you philo love me? And so he says to him, Lord, you oida know, experientially know. You know experientially all things. You know genosko know. You genosko know. You know intellectually that I philo love you. Jesus says to him, tend my sheep. So there's a lot to unpack there. That's a fascinating exchange. We'll see what's going on there. And we'll kind of bring that passage to life here. And I think that will finish us next week. So God bless you, church. Thank you for being with me. Thank you for staying with me. And we are Legacy Bible Church. We are restoring the meaning of the Scriptures intended by their authors, intended by the New Testament authors, intended by Jesus in his earthly ministry teaching, where he's looking toward the new covenant as he's teaching in the Gospel of John. We'll continue working for probably another couple of weeks in the Gospel of John, and then we will come back to 1 John and continue on there. So God bless you. We will be hopefully with Sarah, God willing, here this coming week for another Q&A, and then we'll see you next Sunday at 10:30. God bless you.